The member for Bateman.
Thanks. I'm pleased today to make a contribution to this debate and the bill that's before the House, the Firearms Amendment Bill 2022, which puts into legislation 17 recommendations from the Law Reform Commission review of the Firearms Act 1973, which was tabled in this place in 2016. Very briefly, the bill contains 4 key reforms: the firearms prohibition orders, illegal manufacture of firearms, including firearms technology offences, increased penalties to certain firearm offences relating to stolen firearms and firing a gun in a way that causes fear, and a permanent firearms amnesty. Now, many members in this place have referenced the tragic events of Port Arthur in 1996, in which we know 35 people lost their lives and many more were injured and permanently scarred, traumatised and maimed. And it is worth commending the actions at that time, and I did in my inaugural speech, and without a doubt the bipartisan political action that resulted from that tragic event saw gun-related deaths fall from a mean rate of 3.6 per 100,000 in Australia between 1979 and 1996 to 1.2 per 100,000 between the period of 1997 to 2013. So the data certainly backs up the fact that with less firearms in our community, there are less deaths, there are less injuries. However, there are still illegal firearms circulating in our community, and in fact there are legal firearms in our community that are used illegally. And that's important to note in this debate because we've heard contributions, including that from the member of the opposition just now, commenting on the unintended consequences for legal firearm owners. And she's absolutely right to raise questions and to seek clarification. That is the purpose of this place and the purpose of opposition, and that opportunity will be had particularly in the consideration of in detail. And I grew up in rural areas. I grew up with brothers who owned guns. I understand the need and how they are used in those sorts of communities. But I also just want to draw some attention to a couple of comments and expand on that a little bit, because it's a little bit easy to stand in here and say law-abiding citizens without going beneath that a little bit. So despite the reforms that occurred after Port Arthur and the significant reduction of firearms in our community, we still have 30%, so some statistics, 36% of gun injuries were caused by assault. This is a study between 2002 and 2016 in New South Wales. 21% by accidents and 33% by intentional self-harm. And it's worth noting that the self-harm injuries and death were much more frequent among older people, men, and people living outside major cities. So that is exactly the constituency of the national parties and those who represent the regions. So whilst firearms are necessary at times in these constituencies and are used legally for legitimate purposes, they are also used to harm people in those communities at a much more frequent rate than people who live in metropolitan areas. In metropolitan areas, the major cause or the major cohort or demographic of people who were injured by guns were young men. But the contribution by the member for Swan Hills yesterday was a really thoughtful and meaningful contribution to this place about another unintended consequence, which is that around family and domestic violence, and particularly women. And one of the statistics that she talked about yesterday that jumped out to me was that women are 20 times more likely to be killed when their abuser has access to a firearm. So the member for North West Central yesterday did ask the question that he would be interested to know what percentage of law-abiding citizens who have firearm licences actually commit crimes. And whilst I can't answer that directly for Western Australia, I don't have access to that, I did do some reading where I can perhaps shed some light and give some generalities around what percentage that might be. So in the 16 mass shootings in Australia and New Zealand between 1987 and 2014, 135 people died. And most of these victims, 55%, were shot by previously law-abiding licensed gun owners who using legally held firearms. So that's 55%. But of course, mass shootings, as tragic as they are not the primary cause of gun deaths and injury in Australia. It is typically single shootings, and they typically occur as a result of the interpersonal disputes, such as what the member for Swan Hills referenced around family and domestic violence. And so the research supports as well that around 43% of those types of incidences, that's so people known to each other, gun deaths, was perpetrated by somebody holding a licensed gun. So that may be something that you could extrapolate generally to the Western Australian context as well, not being significantly different. So the reason I raise this is simply to say that I think any look at how we can strengthen our gun licensing legislation has and has been demonstrated in the past to have a positive impact on reducing deaths and injuries, and that is a good thing for all constituencies, including those in rural areas who do use guns legitimately. But of course, this legislation is not targeted specifically at that. It is very much about targeting criminal and bikie gangs in particular. And that is a significant problem in our community and in Western Australia, and I know that from sort of chats with my husband as well when he served as a police officer. And he shared with me about a job that they went to in Wyndham. So this is very remote Western Australia, and a licensed firearm holder had 44 guns stolen. 44 guns in an isolated community, stolen by a criminal syndicate that probably came, suspected, from across the border. So this is interstate and indeed international crime gangs that target licensed gun users and then put those weapons into the community in a way where they are used illegally to create fear and cause danger and risk to law-abiding members of our community. The police can only act with the tools that they have. That's sort of something when people respond to spikes in crime or, discuss the kind of wicked problems that society face, they say, what are the police doing? And I think we heard echoes of that yesterday, sadly, in the contribution from the member for North West Central. What are the police doing? In fact, I think they were exact words that I could find in Hansard. Well, the police are doing everything they possibly can with the tools that they have, and they're to be commended for the hard work that they do in our community day in and day out. And they face the risk of these guns. They face the risk of turning up to jobs and having a firearm pulled on them. And they face the risk of stopping a car and potentially finding weapons or ammunition. It's a dangerous role, and they do pop up frequently. And so I commend the police. And it's critical that we give them every opportunity to do their job, to serve the West Australian community, to keep us all safe. And the tool that they have is legislation. We give the WA police the tools that they need to do their job. And that's what we're doing in this chamber today with this bill. Just today, in fact, there was a story in the West about a police and Australian Border Force raid in which a firearms workshop was uncovered, and that included silencers and a homemade bomb. So this risk is present and it's real. So the Firearms Prohibition Order Scheme is a really important tool for Western Australia Police to target those that they suspect or that they believe are not of good character, who do pose a threat to the community, to act proactively rather than reactively after a crime has already taken place and after people have already been injured or potentially killed. So these are a really important tool that will strengthen the ability for the WA Police to intervene early and hopefully prevent crime, which is always their first goal. Other aspects of this legislation that increase So this risk is present and it's real. So the Firearms Prohibition Order Scheme is a really important tool for Western Australia Police to target those that they suspect or that they believe are not of good character, who do pose a threat to the community, to act proactively rather than reactively after a crime has already taken place and after people have already been injured or potentially killed. So these are a really important tool that will strengthen the ability for the WA Police to intervene early and hopefully prevent crime, which is always their first goal. Other aspects of this legislation that increase the penalties to bring in line with community expectations. Guns can cause significant damage and death. They are a lethal weapon. And so there is an expectation that if people steal weapons or they trade in weapons illegally or they otherwise conduct themselves in an illegal way around weapons, that the penalties should adequately reflect that. The other part of this bill and legislation that I would like to speak to is the firearms amnesty. And I think it's a really important part because there are people who perhaps hold a firearm that they've had handed down from previous generations, that for some reason they've had legitimately in the past before legislation was changed, and aren't quite sure what to do with that and how to dispose of that properly and responsibly, but without getting themselves into trouble. So the permanent firearms amnesty is an opportunity for all those who are perhaps holding a weapon that they're not quite sure what to do with to please come forward and hand that in to the police and know that there will not be any penalties for those persons that are doing that. So I would really like to congratulate the Minister for Police for bringing this legislation into the House. It's very important legislation. It speaks to one of the issues that I raised in my inaugural speech that's very important to my heart, the kind of trauma from guns and in particular criminal elements in our community. We need to act together to do all that we can to prevent that kind of damage. So congratulations, Minister for Police. I absolutely support this bill.